In the 1990s, Darlene and David from the hit sitcom Roseanne were America's ultimate rebellious teen couple. Fans lost their minds when they found out the actors, Sara Gilbert and Johnny Galecki, were passionately dating in real life too. But right in the middle of their heavily publicized romance, Sara realized a terrifying truth. She was gay. In an era where coming out meant instant career death and ruthless tabloid humiliation, she was trapped in a glass closet, panicked and entirely alone. Terrified, she made a heartbreaking confession to her boyfriend. But what Johnny Galecki did next didn't just save her life. It exposed the absolute toxicity of the 90s Hollywood machine. This is the hidden truth behind television's most perfect fake romance. The collision of their lives was orchestrated by a television industry desperate to capture the shifting mood of the American working class. Long before they met on a soundstage in Studio City, Sara Gilbert and Johnny Galecki were navigating entirely different survival courses within the entertainment business. Their childhoods were defined by opposing financial pressures and family dynamics, creating the perfect psychological storm for the bond they would eventually form. Sara Gilbert was born into the suffocating legacy of Hollywood royalty. Her name at birth was Sarah Rebecca Abeles. She grew up in the massive, inescapable shadow of her older half-siblings, Melissa and Jonathan Gilbert, who were already global television stars on Little House on the Prairie. Her family environment was inextricably linked to the mechanics of fame. She witnessed firsthand the financial windfalls, the ruthless tabloid scrutiny, and the complete loss of privacy that accompanied child stardom. She did not enter the acting profession with naive, wide-eyed ambition. She entered it with a cynical, clinical awareness of the transaction taking place. At the age of 9, she legally adopted the surname Gilbert, a calculated career move to leverage the family brand. From a very young age, she was a highly valuable asset, carrying the financial and reputational weight of a television dynasty. Johnny Galecki arrived in Los Angeles carrying a completely different kind of burden. He was born in Belgium to American parents stationed at a military base, but he was raised in Oak Park, Illinois. His family was firmly rooted in the working class. His father was a civilian instructor for the Air Force, and his mother was a mortgage consultant. There were no industry connections, no nepotism, and no safety nets. When Galecki decided to pursue acting, it was a high-stakes financial gamble for his family. He moved to Los Angeles as a young teenager, effectively living alone in small rented apartments. He carried the terrifying responsibility of earning his own keep in one of the most ruthless cities on earth. He took whatever minor television roles and commercial gigs he could secure to pay his rent and avoid the humiliation of moving back to the Midwest in defeat. He hustled his way into the industry, building a rugged, independent resilience that stood in stark contrast to the heavily managed lives of his Los Angeles peers. The cultural landscape of American television fractured permanently in the fall of 1988. The ABC network premiered a new sitcom that entirely rejected the wealthy, sanitized, brightly lit families that had dominated the decade. The show was loud, abrasive, and focused on a blue-collar family struggling to pay their mortgage in a fictional Illinois town. It was an immediate, unprecedented ratings juggernaut. Sara Gilbert was cast as the middle daughter, Darlene. She was 13 years old. The character was a revelation to the American public. Darlene was not the bubbly, boy-crazy teenage archetype the network executives usually demanded. She was sarcastic, tomboyish, and deeply cynical. She wore oversized flannel shirts and delivered withering insults with a deadpan precision that terrified adult actors. She became the defining voice of the emerging grunge generation. The success of the show fundamentally altered Sara's reality. The financial compensation was astronomical. She was suddenly earning more money in a single week than most American families earned in a decade. But this immense wealth came at a severe psychological cost. She lost her anonymity overnight. She could not walk into a grocery store or attend a public school without being mobbed. She was a teenager trapped inside a highly visible, highly profitable corporate machine. The network executives viewed her as a crucial demographic hook, a vital component in retaining their younger viewership. The pressure to maintain the edgy, relatable persona of Darlene while navigating the terrifying biological and emotional changes of adolescence was a crushing, solitary burden. 4 years into the massive success of the show, the writers decided Darlene needed a romantic foil. The casting directors scoured Los Angeles for a young actor who could match Sara's formidable comedic timing and project an authentic, working-class vulnerability. In 1992, a 17-year-old Johnny Galecki walked onto the soundstage. He was cast as Kevin Healy, a character later inexplicably renamed David. The dynamic between the two actors was instantaneous. Johnny was entirely different from the polished, stage-managed child stars Sara usually encountered on the studio lot. He had a quiet, observant intensity. He rode motorcycles. He lived on his own. He possessed a maturity forged by his independent survival in Los Angeles. Sara, deeply guarded and exhausted by the artificiality of her environment, found an immediate sense of safety in his presence. The characters they played were the Romeo and Juliet of the flannel generation. Darlene was the aggressive, dominating force, while David was the sensitive, artistic, and deeply polite outsider. They were two teenagers who felt entirely alienated from the world, finding a quiet sanctuary in each other's company. The television audience did not just watch them, they fiercely identified with them. The chemistry was palpable because it was not entirely manufactured. Behind the cameras, away from the screaming studio audience and the demanding network executives, Sara and Johnny began to isolate themselves from the rest of the cast. The production schedule of a weekly sitcom is a grueling, relentless grind of table reads, blocking rehearsals, and late-night shoots. The soundstage is a loud, chaotic environment filled with hundreds of crew members and the dominating, unpredictable energy of the show's adult stars. Sara and Johnny sought out quiet corners of the studio lot. They ate lunch together in their dressing trailers. They bonded over their shared distaste for the superficiality of Hollywood and the bizarre, unnatural reality of growing up on television. The friendship naturally and seamlessly transitioned into a romantic relationship. It was a completely logical progression. They were two highly intelligent, fiercely private teenagers occupying the exact same strange, isolated universe. For Sara, dating Johnny provided a profound sense of normalcy. He did not care about her family, legacy, or her bank account. He treated her with a genuine, grounding respect. They navigated the aggressive paparazzi and the exhausting press junkets as a unified front. The ABC network and their team of publicists quickly realized the goldmine they had stumbled upon. The real-life romance between their two most popular teenage stars was a massive public relations victory. The marketing department heavily leaned into the narrative. They pushed Sara and Johnny to do joint interviews. They were featured on the covers of teen magazines, cementing their status as the ultimate celebrity couple for a cynical generation. The studio executives celebrated the rising ratings and the lucrative advertising revenue. They believed they had secured the perfect, highly profitable, heterosexual teenage dream. They had absolutely no idea that the foundation of that dream was about to violently collapse. As the calendar turned to 1993, the television rating dominance of the show cemented a strange, highly pressurized reality for the young couple. Away from the flashing bulbs of the red carpets and the carefully curated magazine spreads, their day-to-day existence was a study in profound contrasts. They were attempting to forge a normal teenage relationship while navigating a massive financial and experiential divide. Sara was operating at the absolute pinnacle of the child star economy. Her episodic fee was astronomical, supporting an entire ecosystem of agents, managers, and publicists whose livelihoods depended entirely on her continued mainstream appeal. She lived within a highly insulated bubble, driven through the gates of the studio lot, shielded from the mundane realities of everyday teenage life. Johnny, conversely, was living the gritty reality of an emancipated minor in Los Angeles. He was renting a modest apartment, meticulously managing his own finances, and relying on his steady paycheck to simply keep a roof over his head. He did not have a sprawling Hollywood estate to retreat to when the studio lights turned off. This stark financial disparity could have easily fractured a lesser relationship. But for Sara, Johnny's lack of Hollywood pretense was his most vital attribute. When they left the studio, Johnny insisted on a fiercely independent lifestyle. If they went to a late-night diner after a grueling tape day, he paid the bill out of his own wallet. He refused to be absorbed into the wealthy, sycophantic machinery that surrounded her. He offered her a tether to the actual world, a space where she was not an incredibly valuable corporate asset, but simply a teenage girl figuring out her life. For a young woman surrounded by adults who constantly needed something from her, Johnny's unassuming independence was a profound psychological relief. The environment they worked in only intensified their reliance on one another. By the 5th season, the soundstage was a notoriously volatile workplace. The adult stars of the sitcom were navigating massive, highly publicized personal dramas and power struggles behind the scenes. The backstage atmosphere was often thick with tension, shouting matches, and unpredictable mood swings. In the midst of this chaotic adult dysfunction, Sara and Johnny became an island of quiet stability. They sat together in the shadows of the massive lighting rigs, observing the madness, completely aligned in their cynical, detached humor. He was her absolute best friend, her primary confidant, and her only reliable safe space in an industry designed to exploit her. But the machinery of network television never stops demanding more from its actors. As their characters aged, the writing staff naturally pushed Darlene and David into more mature, romantically complex storylines. The scripts no longer just called for sarcastic banter. They demanded physical intimacy. They were required to hold each other, to stare deeply into each other's eyes, and to kiss in front of 300 live audience members and millions of viewers at home. The line between their fictional romance and their actual relationship completely dissolved. The affection they displayed on camera naturally bled into their private lives. They were two teenagers spending 12 hours a day together, deeply emotionally connected, and the societal expectation was that they would be physically intimate. They did what any normal, devoted teenage couple would do. They tried to build a romantic life behind closed doors. This is where the fairy tale narrative constructed by the public relations team violently collided with human biology. When their relationship crossed the threshold from deep emotional friendship into physical romantic intimacy, Sara experienced a severe psychological reaction. It was not a sudden dramatic cinematic realization. It was a creeping, heavy, and entirely confusing dread. She genuinely loved Johnny. She loved his mind. She felt fiercely protective of him, and she cherished the safety he provided. Yet, whenever they became physically affectionate, her body and her mind rebelled. She experienced a profound sense of detachment, a feeling that she was suddenly reading lines from a script she had never memorized. She later described this specific period as being enveloped by a sudden, inexplicable depression. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. On paper, she had everything a teenage girl was supposed to want. She had an incredibly kind, handsome, devoted boyfriend who understood the bizarre pressures of her life. She was the envy of millions of adolescent girls reading the teen magazines, but in the quiet moments alone with him, the physical reality of heterosexual romance felt entirely wrong, unnatural, and deeply upsetting. For months, she internalized this dread, turning the blame entirely upon herself. The concept of being gay was so far removed from the acceptable reality of her environment that she did not initially connect the dots. She assumed she was broken. She assumed the relentless stress of her career, the chaotic environment of the set, or her own inherent cynicism, was destroying her ability to be a good girlfriend. She tried to force herself to feel the romantic sparks that the magazines insisted she should be feeling. She engaged in a brutal campaign of internal gaslighting, desperately trying to contort her authentic self into the shape the world demanded. As 1993 progressed, the truth became impossible to ignore. The suffocating depression she felt during moments of intimacy was not a symptom of stress. It was the heavy, undeniable weight of her actual sexual orientation. She realized she simply did not possess romantic feelings for men. Sara Gilbert was a lesbian. The terror that accompanied this realization cannot be overstated. We must look closely at the cultural and political climate of America during this exact time frame to understand why a teenager could not simply speak her truth. The early 90s were a period of intense hostility toward the LGBTQ community. In 1992, the state of Colorado passed Amendment 2, explicitly preventing any city from enacting anti-discrimination laws to protect gay citizens. In 1993, the federal government instituted the draconian military policy that would eventually ruin thousands of lives by forcing gay service members to hide their identities or face immediate discharge. The entertainment industry reflected this conservative hostility with absolute rigidity. Network television was entirely reliant on the financial goodwill of major corporate sponsors, companies that sold laundry detergent, minivans, and cereal to middle-class suburban families. These sponsors were highly risk-averse. The unwritten rule in the executive boardrooms of ABC was crystal clear. If an actor alienates the core demographic, the actor is replaced. Sara was not playing a minor background character. She was the edgy, relatable sweetheart of a multi-billion-dollar syndication empire. Her appeal was rooted in the idea that teenage boys wanted to date her and teenage girls wanted to be her. If she was outed as a lesbian, she believed with absolute certainty that she would not just lose her job, but she would single-handedly destroy the financial viability of the entire show. She envisioned the conservative boycotts, the pulled advertising contracts, and the fury of the executives who had invested millions in her image. She was convinced that her personal truth was a radioactive bomb that would obliterate her family's meticulously built Hollywood legacy and put hundreds of crew members out of work. The tabloids of the era added an element of predatory menace to her fear. The paparazzi culture of the 90s was completely unregulated and breathtakingly cruel. They hunted celebrities, digging through trash cans and paying off associates for scandalous tips. For a teenager, the prospect of being outed by a tabloid magazine was a fate worse than career death. It was the promise of utter public humiliation. She would be transformed from a respected actress into a sordid punchline on late-night talk shows. This suffocating environment forced her to construct an elaborate fortress of secrecy. She had to continue arriving at the studio lot every morning, slipping into the oversized flannel shirts and delivering her lines flawlessly. She had to sit in makeup chairs and listen to casual homophobic banter from crew members, staying entirely silent. She had to walk out onto the stage, look into the eyes of the boy she was actively deceiving, and kiss him for the cameras. The guilt of maintaining this deception with Johnny became the heaviest burden of all. He was not a cynical Hollywood player. He was a young man from Illinois who had given her his genuine heart. He was patient when she was distant. He was kind when she was depressed. And he was completely oblivious to the internal war tearing her apart. Every time he held her hand in public, to appease the publicists every time he paid for her dinner, and every time he defended her from the chaos of the set, she felt the sharp, sickening sting of betrayal. She was using the only person in the world she actually trusted as a human shield against a society that would despise her. The physical toll of this massive psychological repression began to manifest. She was exhausted, anxious, and deeply isolated. She was living a double life in the most heavily scrutinized city on the planet. The pressure was building against the walls of her mind, creating a terrifying critical mass. She knew she could not sustain the lie indefinitely. The depression was swallowing her whole, and the guilt of hurting Johnny was becoming unbearable. She reached a precipice where the terror of continuing the deception finally outweighed the terror of the consequences. She had to tell him the truth, fully knowing that the words she was about to speak held the power to destroy her sanctuary, detonate her career, and unleash the wrath of the entire Hollywood machine upon her. The breaking point arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, terrifying admission. Sara had reached the absolute limit of her psychological endurance. The physical toll of the anxiety was manifesting, and the guilt of deceiving the young man sitting across from her had become heavier than the fear of the industry. The exact setting of the conversation remains a private detail between the two of them, shielded from the public record, but the emotional mechanics of that moment represent a pivotal shift in modern Hollywood history. She looked at Johnny Galecki, a young man who had invested his genuine affection and his fragile teenage ego into their relationship, and she finally spoke the words she believed would destroy her life. She told him she was gay. She told him the depression she felt during their intimate moments was not a reflection of his worth, but a fundamental truth about her own biology. She handed him the weapon that could annihilate her career, her family's legacy, and her personal safety. And she waited for the detonation. To fully grasp the magnitude of what happened next, it is necessary to examine the rigid confines of adolescent masculinity in the early 1990s. The cultural blueprint for a young man in that era was incredibly narrow. Vulnerability was penalized. Masculinity was inextricably linked to sexual conquest and outward displays of dominance. Homophobia was not just normalized, it was a casual, everyday currency used in locker rooms, comedy clubs, and television scripts to police male behavior. For a teenage boy, especially one thrust into the hyper-competitive, ego-driven arena of the entertainment industry, romantic rejection is a bitter pill. But being told by your girlfriend that she is fundamentally incapable of being attracted to men is a specific, profound blow to the adolescent ego. The standard conditioned response for a young man in that environment would be defensive anger. The instinct is to protect the bruised ego by lashing out, by turning the sadness into a weapon. Johnny Galecki possessed every societal excuse to react poorly. He could have stormed out. He could have allowed his hurt feelings to metastasize into bitterness. More dangerously, he held the ultimate power of retaliation. In an era where the tabloids were actively hunting for the slightest hint of scandal to derail the pristine images of child stars, a single anonymous phone call to a gossip columnist would have been catastrophic for Sara. He could have outed her out of spite, collected a quiet paycheck from a tabloid, and watched from a safe distance as the conservative media apparatus tore her life apart. He could have easily painted himself as the victim of a manipulative co-star. He did absolutely none of those things. When faced with the terrifying, vulnerable truth of the girl sitting across from him, Johnny Galecki completely subverted the toxic expectations of his gender and his industry. He absorbed the shock. He swallowed the immediate sting of rejection. He did not make the moment about his own bruised pride. Instead, he looked at Sara and saw the sheer paralyzing terror in her eyes. He recognized that the secret she had just handed him was not a personal insult. It was a death sentence in the court of public opinion. His reaction was an act of extraordinary, quiet heroism. He immediately pivoted from a wounded boyfriend to a fiercely protective ally. He listened. He validated her reality. He assured her that she was not broken and that there was nothing inherently wrong with who she was. In a matter of minutes, the fundamental architecture of their relationship shifted. The romantic tension evaporated, replaced by a profound, unbreakable solidarity. They were no longer two teenagers trying to figure out how to date under the studio lights. They were co-conspirators actively fighting against a system that wanted to crush one of them. This was not a passive acceptance. Johnny recognized that merely keeping the secret was not enough. The network publicists and the paparazzi were relentless. If they suddenly broke up, the press would immediately begin hunting for the reasons why. They would dig into Sara's private life, monitor her movements, and relentlessly question her co-stars. The sudden absence of the relationship would create a vacuum that the tabloids would eagerly fill with dangerous speculation. To ensure her absolute safety, Johnny made a remarkable commitment. He agreed to actively maintain the deception. In the cold, cynical terminology of the entertainment industry, he agreed to become her beard, a male companion strategically used to conceal a person's homosexuality from the public and the press. The logistics of this arrangement required a staggering level of daily discipline and emotional maturity. They had to continue going to work on the soundstage of the biggest comedy in America, surrounded by crew members, producers, and executives who were entirely oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just occurred. They had to sit at the table reads and deliver dialogue about their fictional romance. They had to step in front of the live studio audience and execute physical comedy and romantic kisses, knowing that the entire dynamic between them had fundamentally changed. But the most exhausting performance took place off the set. The network's public relations machine continued to churn, demanding fuel for the teenage magazines and the entertainment news segments. Johnny willingly stepped into the line of fire. When the red carpets called, he put on his suit, stood beside her, and held her hand. When the cameras flashed, he offered the specific, devoted smile that the magazines demanded. He willingly surrendered a portion of his own authentic teenage experience to serve as a human shield for his best friend. This pact forged a bond that transcended the typical Hollywood friendship. They were sharing a massive, dangerous secret in a city built entirely on gossip and betrayal. Johnny's willingness to stay by her side provided Sara with something she had entirely lost the ability to feel: safety, because he was there, holding her hand and running interference with the press. She was allowed the necessary time and space to breathe. She did not have to constantly look over her shoulder. She did not have to constantly invent lies about her weekend plans. She had a partner in the deception, someone who validated her reality behind closed doors while aggressively protecting it in public. This period of their lives highlights a stark, uncomfortable truth about the 1990s entertainment industry. The environment was so profoundly toxic, so aggressively hostile to authentic human identity, that the only way for a young gay woman to survive was to build a fortress of lies, guarded by a sympathetic male co-star. The network executives patted themselves on the back for creating a groundbreaking, edgy sitcom that spoke to the realities of the working class. Yet they simultaneously fostered a corporate culture of fear so intense that their teenage stars had to form secret alliances just to survive the workday. The irony is profound. The public believed they were watching a rebellious anti-establishment couple on their television screens every Tuesday night. Darlene and David were celebrated for challenging the status quo. But the true rebellion was not happening in the scripts written by the adult writers' room. The true rebellion was happening in the quiet moments between takes when two teenagers silently agreed to sabotage the network's pristine public relations campaign to protect a basic human right. They were actively subverting the Hollywood machine from the inside, using the network's own manufactured romance as camouflage. The execution of a massive public deception requires an exhausting daily commitment to the performance. Once the private agreement was forged between Sara Gilbert and Johnny Galecki, they had to operationalize their lie. The safe space they created in the shadows of the soundstage now had to withstand the blistering scrutiny of the mid-90s entertainment press. They transitioned from two teenagers naturally falling in love to two highly coordinated actors executing a tactical defense strategy. The mechanics of this cover-up were meticulous. They understood that the media apparatus was always hungry for content, and if they starved the beast entirely, it would start digging for reasons why. Therefore, they fed the public relations machine precisely measured doses of their fabricated romance. They developed a shared vocabulary of evasive answers, deflecting probing questions about their future with charming, self-deprecating humor that perfectly aligned with their cynical television personas. This choreographed dance provided Sara with an impenetrable layer of camouflage. While the tabloids were busy analyzing her red carpet outfits and speculating about her fictional dating life with Johnny, they were completely blind to her actual reality. The strategy worked flawlessly. Johnny played his role with such convincing, quiet devotion that nobody in the notoriously cynical Hollywood press corps suspected a thing. He effectively neutralized the paparazzi threat by giving them exactly the boring, stable teenage romance they expected to see. However, the psychological stamina required to maintain this dual existence began to heavily tax Sara as she transitioned from adolescence into early adulthood. The protective bubble Johnny provided kept her career safe, but it also locked her inside a state of arrested emotional development. While her peers were freely exploring their identities, dating openly and making the normal messy mistakes of young adulthood, Sara was forced to compartmentalize her romantic life into a deep, subterranean vault. If she wanted to date women, the logistics were terrifying. She could not simply walk into a gay bar in West Hollywood. She could not hold a partner's hand in a restaurant. Every interaction was laced with the paralyzing fear of exposure. A single photograph taken by a patron with a disposable camera, or a loose-lipped bartender looking for a quick payout from a gossip magazine, could detonate the bomb she and Johnny had worked so hard to defuse. She lived with a chronic low-grade paranoia, constantly scanning rooms, analyzing the loyalties of her social circle, and anticipating betrayal from every angle. This intense isolation was violently validated by the cultural earthquake that struck the television industry in the spring of 1997. For years, Sara had operated under the terrifying assumption that the American public and the network executives would mercilessly destroy a gay television star. In April of that year, she watched that assumption become a horrific reality. Ellen DeGeneres, the star of a massive ABC sitcom on the exact same network as Roseanne, made the courageous decision to publicly come out. She appeared on the cover of Time magazine, and her character came out in a highly publicized episode. The immediate aftermath was a bloodbath. The cultural backlash was swift, vicious, and deeply personal. Major corporate sponsors immediately pulled their advertising dollars from the network. Religious organizations mobilized boycotts and sent bomb threats to the studio. The media landscape, rather than celebrating her honesty, turned her into a polarizing, heavily scrutinized target. Shortly after the revelation, the network buckled under the pressure and canceled her sitcom. Ellen's career effectively flatlined for years, and she was plunged into a period of intense professional exile and public mockery. For Sara Gilbert, watching the systemic destruction of the biggest star on her own network was a chilling, deeply traumatic experience. It was the absolute confirmation of her darkest fears. The industry had just publicly executed one of its own for telling the truth. If they could do that to a beloved adult stand-up comedian, she knew exactly what they would do to a 22-year-old actress playing a cynical working-class daughter. The Ellen backlash permanently reinforced the doors of Sara's closet. It cemented her conviction that the lie she was living alongside Johnny was not just a temporary inconvenience, it was a matter of absolute professional and personal survival. Just weeks after the Ellen controversy dominated the national headlines, the original run of Roseanne came to an end in May of 1997. After 9 years of anchoring the ABC network, the sets of the Connor household were finally dismantled. The cast and crew dispersed, and the immediate daily pressure of the television production schedule evaporated. The conclusion of the sitcom presented a critical logistical challenge for Sara and Johnny. The primary reason for their heavily publicized romance, the promotional engine of the television show, was gone. They now had to carefully untangle their public narrative without raising suspicion. They executed this final phase of the deception with the same quiet precision they had used to maintain it. They did not issue a dramatic press release announcing a breakup. They did not grant exclusive interviews detailing a heartbreak. They simply allowed the public relationship to quietly age out. They stopped appearing on red carpets together. They gently phased out the joint public appearances. When occasionally asked by the press, they offered the standard boring Hollywood platitudes. They were moving in different directions, focusing on their respective careers, and remaining the best of friends. Because they had always projected a grounded, low-key dynamic, the media accepted this natural dissolution without questioning the underlying mechanics. The fake relationship died a quiet, unremarkable death, exactly as they had planned. With the show over and the public romance successfully dismantled, Sara seized the opportunity to physically and geographically escape the Hollywood fishbowl. She had previously enrolled at Yale University, remarkably managing to balance an Ivy League education with her grueling television shooting schedule. Now she relocated to New Haven, Connecticut, full-time to complete her degree in art with honors. The contrast between the oppressive, glaring lights of Los Angeles and the quiet academic anonymity of Yale was profound. For the first time in nearly a decade, she was not surrounded by publicists, executives, or paparazzi. She was just another student walking across a historic campus in the brutal New England winter. This geographical distance provided her with a crucial, albeit temporary, reprieve. In the underground, fiercely protective queer communities of academia, she found a small fraction of the freedom she had been denied in California. She could breathe a little easier, insulated by a culture that valued intellect over tabloid gossip. Meanwhile, Johnny Galecki remained in Los Angeles, tasked with navigating the notoriously difficult transition from a famous teenage sitcom star to a working adult actor. In Hollywood, information is the most valuable currency. A secret of the magnitude he was holding, the hidden sexuality of one of the decade's most famous television daughters, was worth a fortune. He could have easily monetized it. He could have casually leaked it at an industry party to gain favor with a powerful producer. He could have used it to generate headlines for his own independent film projects. He never did. He locked the secret away and threw away the key. He went to work grinding out roles in films like Suicide Kings and I Know What You Did Last Summer, completely severing his professional identity from the Roseanne era. He built his adult career on his own merit, refusing to trade on the vulnerability of the woman who had trusted him. His silence was absolute. It was a testament to a level of integrity that is almost entirely foreign to the entertainment industry. As the late 90s bled into the early 2000s, the cultural climate remained painfully slow to evolve. Sara eventually returned to Los Angeles to resume her acting career, but the shadow of the closet followed her. She took on guest starring roles and recurring characters on various television dramas, constantly modulating her behavior, vetting her social circles, and ensuring her private life remained completely opaque to the press. She was a grown woman, a successful Yale graduate, and a respected veteran of the industry, yet she was still forced to operate with the extreme caution of a fugitive. The psychological weight of this prolonged hiding is corrosive. It forces a person to constantly edit their own narrative, to second-guess every interaction, and to carry a persistent, exhausting vigilance. She was safe largely because Johnny's flawless execution of their cover story had permanently diverted the press's attention years ago, but she was not free. They remained deeply connected during this long silence. The romantic facade had long been discarded, leaving behind a profound platonic soulmate dynamic. They were the only two people who truly understood the bizarre, traumatic crucible they had survived together on the soundstage of Stage 2 at the CBS Studio Center. When they saw each other, they didn't have to explain the lingering anxieties or the strange, lasting side effects of child stardom. Johnny remained her fiercest protector, a silent guardian who knew exactly what it had cost her to simply exist in an industry that demanded absolute conformity. They were waiting for the world to change, holding their breath in the dark, hoping that eventually the cultural machinery would evolve enough to allow her to simply step into the light. As the calendar flipped from the 1990s into the early 2000s, the entertainment industry underwent a brutal technological evolution. The paparazzi culture, once confined to print magazines with monthly publication schedules, mutated into a 24-hour digital surveillance machine. The birth of celebrity gossip blogs and the aggressive rise of paparazzi agencies meant that actors were no longer just hunted on red carpets. They were tracked at grocery stores, gas stations, and medical clinics. For Sara Gilbert, who had just returned to Los Angeles from the academic sanctuary of Yale University, this new landscape was a minefield. She was entering her late 20s, a period when adult professionals typically lay the foundation for their permanent lives. In 2001, she quietly began a relationship with television producer Allison Adler. They were two ambitious, intelligent women working within the same volatile industry, building a genuine, committed life together. But because of the suffocating, lingering homophobia of network television executives and the predatory nature of the new digital tabloids, their home had to function as an impenetrable fortress. The logistical and psychological acrobatics required to maintain a hidden, same-sex partnership in Hollywood during the early 2000s were exhausting. Sara was working steadily, securing recurring roles on massive primetime dramas like ER and 24. To protect her livelihood, she operated under a self-imposed media blackout regarding her personal life. When she attended industry functions, she walked the red carpet alone. If journalists asked about her dating status, she offered polite, sterile deflections. She deliberately kept her public profile low, actively avoiding the intense spotlight of leading roles that would inevitably invite deeper scrutiny into her domestic reality. This was the hidden financial cost of the closet. To stay safe, Sara had to actively throttle her own ambition. She possessed the talent, the timing, and the immense audience goodwill to carry her own sitcom, but the risk of exposure was simply too high. Stepping into the center of the frame meant inviting the tabloids to dig into her background. It meant exposing Allison to the viciousness of the internet. Therefore, she chose financial and professional modesty as a survival tactic. She played the supporting friend, the sarcastic doctor, the brilliant analyst, characters that allowed her to earn a living without offering her soul to the corporate machine. While Sara was meticulously managing her invisibility, Johnny Galecki was navigating his own treacherous professional wilderness. The transition from a beloved teenage sitcom character to a respected adult actor is a graveyard of broken careers. For nearly a decade, Johnny fought tooth and nail to separate himself from the ghost of David Healy. The financial anxiety of this period was real. He was no longer collecting the massive syndication checks of a network anchor. He took roles in independent films, accepted brief guest appearances on television comedies, and even relocated to New York to work in theater. He was grinding away, actively rebuilding his artistic credibility from the ground up. Throughout these wilderness years, their friendship remained a quiet, unbreakable constant. They were no longer the terrified teenagers huddled in a dressing room, but adult professionals navigating the unforgiving mechanics of Hollywood. Johnny knew exactly who Sara was coming home to, and he guarded that information with the same absolute integrity he had shown when he was 17 years old. He never leveraged his insider knowledge for a headline, even when his own career was struggling for traction. He proved that his loyalty was not a temporary phase of adolescence, but a foundational character trait? The narrative took a wildly unexpected turn in 2007. The television landscape was shifting again, and the CBS network was launching a new sitcom about a group of brilliant, socially inept physicists. Johnny Galecki was cast in the leading role of Dr. Leonard Hofstadter on The Big Bang Theory. The show was a massive, unprecedented global phenomenon. Within a few short seasons, Johnny was catapulted back into the absolute stratosphere of television fame, eventually becoming one of the highest-paid actors in the history of the medium, commanding $1 million per episode. The irony of this situation was profound. Johnny was once again the anchor of a multi-billion-dollar comedy empire, but this time, he possessed the power, the maturity, and the industry leverage to dictate his own terms. And one of the ways he exercised that power was by bringing his oldest friend back into his orbit. During the show's first season, the producers needed an actress to play Leslie Winkle, a fiercely intelligent, sarcastic physicist who frequently humiliated and casually dated Johnny's character. Sara Gilbert was cast in the role. The reunion of Darlene and David on a completely different soundstage 15 years later was a surreal, deeply emotional milestone. They were standing under the bright studio lights, reading dialogue about a fictional romance and kissing for the cameras all over again. But the terror that had defined their interactions in the 90s was completely gone. This time, there was no suffocating PR machine forcing them to lie to the press. There was no internal panic tearing Sara apart. They were two seasoned, wealthy adult professionals entirely secure in their identities and their friendship. When the director yelled cut, they didn't have to retreat to separate trailers to manage a crisis. They could laugh, analyze the scene, and enjoy the profound comfort of working alongside someone who had known them since they were children. Johnny was now the undisputed star of the lot, but he treated Sara with the exact same quiet reverence and protective respect he had shown her when they were kids. The Big Bang Theory provided a strange, beautiful, full-circle moment, a chance for them to rewrite their on-screen history without the trauma. However, off the set, Sara's personal life was reaching a critical pressure point. The deception that had started as a self-preservation tactic in 1993 was becoming fundamentally incompatible with her reality as an adult woman. In 2004, Sara and Allison Adler welcomed a son, Levi. 3 years later, in 2007, Sara gave birth to a daughter, Sawyer. The introduction of children fundamentally alters the moral calculus of living in the closet. Sara was no longer just protecting her own career. She was raising two human beings. How do you explain to a child that their family structure is a secret? How do you teach a child to be proud of who they are when you are actively hiding your own truth from the world? The logistical nightmare of hiding a pregnancy and a growing family from the Los Angeles paparazzi was staggering. Sara went to extraordinary lengths to shield her children from the cameras. She avoided heavily trafficked public parks, timed her grocery shopping to avoid photographers, and lived in a constant state of hypervigilance. The psychological toll of this existence is corrosive. It forces a mother to treat her own family as a scandal waiting to happen. She was a deeply devoted parent, yet the industry she worked in made her feel like she was harboring a dirty secret. The cultural atmosphere in America was violently divided. In 2008, the state of California passed Proposition 8, a highly controversial ballot initiative that eliminated the right of same-sex couples to marry. The political rhetoric surrounding the campaign was toxic and inescapable. Sara was raising her children in a state that had just publicly voted to invalidate her family's civil rights. The silence that had once kept her safe was beginning to feel like complicity. She realized that by refusing to acknowledge her family publicly, she was inadvertently reinforcing the exact same shame and stigma that the political campaigns were broadcasting. This internal conflict perfectly collided with a massive career ambition. By 2010, Sara recognized a glaring void in the daytime television landscape. The existing talk shows were heavily polished, highly produced, and often disconnected from the messy, chaotic reality of modern motherhood. She envisioned a new format, a panel of mothers from different backgrounds, discussing the news, sharing their personal struggles, and speaking to the audience with unfiltered honesty. She developed the concept, pitched it to the CBS network, and secured the green light to produce and co-host the talk. It was a brilliant, highly lucrative professional triumph. Sara was no longer just an actress waiting for the phone to ring. She was an executive producer creating her own empire. But the fundamental premise of daytime television presented an impossible dilemma. Daytime talk shows are not built on acting. They are built on parasocial relationships. The audience tunes in every single morning because they feel a personal connection to the hosts. They expect to hear about their weekend plans, their marital arguments, and the funny things their children said at breakfast. Authenticity is the primary currency of the medium. Sara realized with sudden, absolute clarity that she could not sit at a table with 4 other women every day, look directly into the camera, and lie to the American public about who she was going home to. She could not build a brand on honesty while actively hiding the most important people in her life. The safety net she had constructed decades ago had become a professional barricade. If she wanted to host this show, if she wanted to be the executive producer of her own destiny, the closet had to be destroyed. The decision was terrifying. She was preparing to risk her brand new multi-million-dollar television show before it even aired. She was preparing to finally face the exact cultural backlash she had spent her entire adult life running from. But she was no longer the terrified, isolated teenager sitting on the set of Roseanne. She was a 35-year-old mother of 2, backed by a lifetime of hard-won industry respect and supported by a fierce, loyal inner circle. She was finally ready to step into the light. The launch of daytime television programs is typically an exercise in heavily managed public relations. But for Sara Gilbert, the premiere of The Talk in October 2010 was a quiet, intensely personal revolution. She did not orchestrate a dramatic, tear-filled sit-down interview with a primetime journalist. She did not secure a glossy magazine cover to announce her sexuality to the world. Having spent her formative teenage years traumatized by the sensationalism of the 90s media machine, she chose a strategy that was far more subversive, brilliant, and ultimately far more powerful: absolute normalization. During the promotional tour for the new program, at a standard press conference surrounded by television executives and journalists, a reporter asked a routine question about her personal life. Sara, without a tremor in her voice or a dramatic pause, simply mentioned her long-term partner Allison and their 2 children. She stated it as an undisputed mundane fact of her existence. The psychological magnitude of this moment cannot be overstated. For nearly 2 decades, the mere thought of uttering those words in a professional setting had induced paralyzing terror. She had spent a lifetime anticipating that this exact admission would result in immediate career execution. But when she finally spoke the truth, the sky did not fall. The CBS network did not pull her funding. The advertisers did not flee in panic. The demographic of middle American housewives, the exact demographic the studio executives of the 1990s were so terrified of offending, did not boycott her show. In fact, they embraced her. They connected with her dry humor, her pragmatic approach to motherhood, and her undeniable authenticity. The financial and emotional gamble paid off spectacularly. The rigid homophobic architecture of the television industry that had imprisoned her in 1993 had fundamentally eroded, and she had survived to see the other side. However, casually mentioning a partner in a press conference is entirely different from unpacking the deeply buried trauma of the closet on national television. Sara had claimed her present reality, but she had not yet reconciled her past. The ghosts of the Roseanne soundstage still lingered, and the public still harbored a massive misconception about her famous teenage romance. The definitive reckoning arrived in September 2013. The producers of The Talk initiated a week-long segment where each co-host was required to reveal a deep, personal secret to the audience. When it was Sara's turn, the atmosphere in the studio shifted entirely. This was not a pre-planned, sterilized public relations statement. She sat at the table, surrounded by her colleagues, and the formidable, cynical armor she had worn since she was a teenager completely dissolved. Her voice shook. She visibly fought back tears. She took millions of viewers back in time, transporting them to the suffocating environment of a 90s television set. She explicitly detailed the terrifying physical and emotional disconnect she experienced when she began dating Johnny Galecki. She described the intense depression that accompanied their physical intimacy and the crushing, isolated realization that she was gay in an industry that actively punished homosexuality. Then she spoke his name. She told the American public exactly what Johnny Galecki had done for her. She did not speak of him as an ex-boyfriend. She spoke of him as a savior. Through her tears, she explained how he had absorbed the shock of her confession without a fraction of ego or malice. She detailed the pact they had made and how he had willingly served as her human shield, holding her hand on red carpets and lying to the global press corps to buy her the time she desperately needed to survive. This television broadcast was a monumental piece of Hollywood history. In a town fundamentally built on narcissism, betrayal, and the ruthless pursuit of self-interest, Sara Gilbert took her moment in the absolute center of the spotlight and used it to give another actor his flowers. She was correcting the historical record. She was ensuring that the world understood that behind the manufactured corporate illusion of Darlene and David, there was a story of profound, authentic human loyalty. She was finally relieving Johnny of the burden of the lie they had carried together for 20 years. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive, but the reaction that mattered most came directly from the man she had just honored. At this specific point in time, Johnny was not a struggling actor desperate for press. He was the anchor of The Big Bang Theory, the undisputed biggest comedy on global television, earning roughly $1 million per episode. He had reached the absolute zenith of the entertainment industry. He had a pristine, highly protected public image. If he had felt any lingering discomfort about being associated with a decades-old deception, he could have easily asked her to keep his name out of it. Before broadcasting her secret, Sara understood the delicate nature of discussing someone else's past. She called Johnny, who was now earning roughly $1 million per episode on The Big Bang Theory, to ask for his permission. Despite his pristine, highly protected public image, his response demonstrated the exact same unwavering class he had shown in 1993. He didn't hesitate. He immediately gave her his absolute blessing, telling her how fiercely proud he was of her for speaking her truth. After the episode aired, he didn't issue a self-congratulatory press release. He simply supported his friend from the sidelines, actively refusing to make the narrative about his own heroism. He proved that his empathy was not a performance enacted for a teenager, it was the bedrock of his character as an adult man. With the secrets of the 90s finally excavated and laid to rest, Sara experienced a profound, accelerated period of personal liberation. She was no longer compartmentalizing her existence. The fear of tabloid exposure, the exhausting hypervigilance, and the persistent low-grade paranoia evaporated. She had stared down the corporate machine, named her truth, and emerged not only unscathed but more powerful than ever. This newfound freedom allowed her to embrace a highly visible, joyous romantic life that would have been entirely unthinkable a decade prior. Following her separation from Allison Adler, Sara began dating Linda Perry, the formidable rock musician and legendary songwriter behind some of the biggest pop hits of the era. Their relationship was the absolute antithesis of Sara's teenage years. There was no hiding. There were no fake dates or orchestrated press deflections. They walked red carpets together, hand in hand, fiercely proud and entirely unapologetic. In March 2014, they were married in a beautiful, highly publicized rock and roll ceremony surrounded by industry peers, friends, and family. Think about the staggering contrast between these two eras of her life. At 18, she was crying in a dressing room, convinced that her capacity to love a woman was a shameful disease that would destroy her family's legacy. At 39, she was standing at an altar, wearing a custom suit, publicly exchanging vows with her wife, while the entertainment press celebrated their union. She had outlasted the toxicity of the industry. She had endured the long, cold winter of the closet, and she had finally stepped into the warmth of an authentic life. However, the definitive triumph of Sara Gilbert's career occurred a few years later, representing the ultimate reversal of Hollywood power dynamics. In 2017, she looked at the deeply fractured, politically divided landscape of the United States and recognized a familiar creative void. She realized that the working class struggles that made Roseanne a cultural touchstone in the 80s and 90s were more relevant than ever. But this time, she did not wait for a group of network executives to call her with a script. Sara Gilbert took control of the intellectual property. She personally conceptualized the revival of the show. She secured the rights, reached out to the original cast members, negotiated the contracts, and pitched the project to the television networks. She was no longer a teenage employee subject to the whims of the studio brass. She was the executive producer. She was the boss. When the Roseanne reboot went into production, the healing of the past was absolute. Sara walked onto the very same CBS Studio Center lot in Studio City where she had once felt so terrified and trapped. But now she owned the room. She dictated the shooting schedule. She had the final say on the scripts. She had successfully taken the machinery that had once exploited her youth and bent it entirely to her own will. The emotional climax of this revival occurred when she successfully convinced Johnny Galecki to return as a guest star, reprising his role as David Healy. Because of his massive contractual obligations to The Big Bang Theory, his time was incredibly limited and highly guarded by his own network. Yet, he made the time to return to the set simply because Sara asked him to. When Darlene and David stood face to face on television once again in 2018, the audience was treated to a masterful, poignant scene between two struggling, complex adults. But the subtext beneath the performance was profoundly moving. The millions of viewers watching at home were completely aware of the real-life history between the two actors. They were no longer watching a manufactured PR fantasy. They were watching two veterans of the Hollywood meat grinder, two people who had survived the absolute worst of the 90s tabloid culture, standing together in quiet victory. The characters of Darlene and David may have been written as broken, struggling people, but the actors playing them were whole, triumphant, and bound by a lifelong loyalty that the industry had completely failed to destroy. The legacy of Sara Gilbert and Johnny Galecki's hidden history is a vital, enduring lesson in the mechanics of modern media. It forces a deeply uncomfortable reckoning with the entertainment we consumed during a notoriously superficial decade. It strips away the comforting nostalgia of the laugh tracks and the brightly colored magazine covers, revealing the stark clinical cruelty of a corporate system that viewed human identity entirely as a variable in a financial equation. The television executives of the 1990s did not care about the psychological well-being of the teenagers they employed. They cared about the demographic spreadsheets, the advertising revenue, and the seamless execution of a profitable illusion. They created an environment so hostile to truth, so actively dangerous to anyone who deviated from the conservative heterosexual norm, that they forced a teenage girl into a state of prolonged, traumatic, psychological isolation. They weaponized the concept of family-friendly entertainment to justify the silent, systematic erasure of an adolescent's authentic humanity. Yet this story is ultimately not a tragedy. It is not defined by the cruelty of the network, but by the extraordinary resilience of the people trapped inside it. It proves that even within the most sterile, unforgiving, and highly monitored corporate environments, genuine human empathy can take root and survive. When Johnny Galecki chose to protect Sara Gilbert, he actively sabotaged the Hollywood machine from the inside out. He used the immense privilege of his own rising stardom and the safety of his own unquestioned heterosexuality to construct a temporary shelter for someone who was entirely vulnerable. He did not seek credit, he did not demand compensation, and he never broke his silence. He simply recognized a terrified friend in the dark, and he refused to let the wolves tear her apart. Sara Gilbert's journey from a frightened, closeted teenager into a formidable television executive, a fiercely proud wife, and a devoted mother is a testament to the sheer unyielding endurance of the human spirit. She refused to let the industry dictate the terms of her existence. She played their game, she survived their gauntlet, and when she finally possessed the power, she dismantled the closet entirely on her own terms, ensuring that the generation of actors following behind her would never have to endure the same suffocating darkness. The camera lenses of Hollywood are designed to capture light, but they are notoriously blind to the truth hidden in the shadows. The saga of Darlene and David stands as one of the most brilliant, successful deceptions in the history of television. For years, the world believed they were watching the perfect execution of a scripted romance. In reality, they were witnessing a masterclass in survival. The executives demanded a marketable love story to sell to middle America, but what Sara Gilbert and Johnny Galecki actually delivered was something far more profound. They delivered a story about the life-saving power of absolute loyalty. They proved that while a network can own your image, dictate your wardrobe, and print your face on a magazine cover, They can never truly legislate the quiet, unbreakable bonds we forge to protect the people we love. In a town built entirely on disposable relationships and fleeting fame, their enduring friendship remains the most beautiful, authentic thing the 90s television machine ever accidentally produced.